I am really excited to. So with that, welcome to our fourth quarterly forum. And our year number one on the next slide is our agenda for this morning. We'll spend just a few minutes this morning welcoming everyone, apparently having a conversation about what the brand will be moving forward for everyone in the built environment. We'll say a few things about the year in review for 2022, and then potentially have a quick chat about the look ahead, although we will definitely spend a bit more time on that at the end as well. Sorry, not potentially, but we will. The policy forum that we'll have includes presentations from our distinguished guests, and as well as a roundtable discussion and hopefully lots of Q&A from everybody on the call. So please do continue to think about those questions, post them in the chat. We'll be keeping an eye on them there. And a few minutes at the end on updates from the 4 working groups, a touch point on the Q1 2023 forum and what the plans are for that, so everyone knows what that looks like ahead of time, and then just a few minutes at the end if there is any remaining Q&A. So with that, to launch into the 2022 year in review, of course, again, a big thank you to the steering committee, and a reminder here about what it is that we've all signed ourselves up for. So the Carbon Leadership Forum issued a challenge, which is to ask all systems engineers to advocate for and achieve net zero carbon in their projects, operational by 2030, aligned to the Architecture 2030 agenda, and Embodied Carbon by 2040. So the 2040 challenge is a challenge issued by the Carbon Leadership Forum, and the commitment that we have all collectively signed up for, both as signatories and supporters, is to number 1, establish a company plan, number 2, request low GWP refrigerants, number 3, request EPDs, and number 4, participate in these quarterly forums. We are going to continue to work on how it is that we're reporting with company plans, reporting annual data, et cetera, as we move forward. These 4 objectives are the first part of the commitment that everyone signed up for, which is great to begin pulling us all together to be on the same page. So our first year, congratulations, everyone. I think we've accomplished a lot of really exciting things, starting first and foremost with a total of 58 signatory firms, 28 supporting organizations. So we're getting up there, and please do continue to share the good work on LinkedIn to the extent that we just want to have as many folks engaged in this as possible so that we're all speaking the same language. Over 100 active working group members. So thank you to all of you who have been actively engaged. And if you have not yet had a chance, please do jump in. And obviously 4 quarterly forums. Today is number 4. On the next slide, just a couple of snapshots of some of the things that we've been able to do. On the resources side, some calls to actions in terms of template letters that are now posted on the MEP 2040 website for you to use with manufacturers and others. Refrigerant calculator that is live and is also available for you to use to be able to have those conversations with your staff, with your clients, with the vendors about what types of refrigerants you're looking at using in your projects and what the impact of those are. And the social media kit, thank you, Andrew. The social media kit, which is a handful of graphics that you can easily grab to represent your participation in the MEP 2040 initiative. On the awareness side, we had lots of buzz around MEP 2040 at Greenbuild this year. Kaylee, Luke, and Josh were representing MEP 2040 at the ASHRAE International Conference in Athens, which was really, really cool. And the White House fact sheet, which is one of the precursors to the conversation today, mentioned MEP 2040 as one of the key initiatives happening in the industry to support lower embodied carbon procurement policies. Last but not least, in the 2022 year in review is on the next slide, with a few of the quotations from all of the good folks who have signed up as signatories and supporters as a reminder of of the commitment that we're all bringing to this, and a significant amount of consistency between the words that folks are using when they sign up and post to the registration form. So thank you again to everyone for all of your engagement over 2022. And with that, I believe, Kaylee, in the next section, we're going to hand it over to another member of the steering committee.
And that member will be Luke.
Yes.
Next slide. Next slide. So as you can see here, blue is the signatory firm, orange is the supporting firm. It's truly amazing. In the last 1 year, we have over 80+ firms sign up in either one of the two roles. Looking forward to the next year, we see a bigger future. As you can see in the bullet points, there are many things that we see this organization will get bigger in different ways. Next slide. One of the concerns during COP and in different discussions is about the Global South. It has to do with some of the Global South countries. Their timeline is beyond 2050, and some of them have no timelines. So we think with MEP 2040, currently we have a heavy US focus. One of the bigger things could be not necessarily top down, but bottom up. Many of the organizations have our branches in Global South and start a bottom up movement in those countries to accelerate the embodied carbon future. Next slide. Hey, besides bigger, we will get better. Better as in, we're gonna have some fun this year. First quarter 2023, we're gonna have to start draft plans of those signatory and questionnaire for the signatories. They are due on the first quarter of next year. Next slide. The other thing that better is we're gonna get data. Now we're discussing how do we collect data and where we're gonna put the data, but this is one of the example of the data. This is actually our firm. If you look really, really hard, you can actually see the project name at the x-axis, and I'll encourage you not to do that. The whole point is not to show you those projects, but the point is the data are available. Different color is different typologies. So now we are discussing how do we collect this data and assemble them and use this data to inform what we're doing. Next slide. And so it's your turn now. Now that we talk about what are the bigger and better things we're going to do next year, can you help us? Help us to tell us what's your vision for us in the next year so that we'll listen and together we'll bring about a better future. Thank you. Next slide.
Awesome. Luke, thank you very much. With that, we are, and please do put your thoughts in the chat so that we can capture those throughout the session, either a vision or a question for the speakers. If you could preface it by saying either vision or a question, that'll help us keep track. And we would love to be able to incorporate all of the notes into the work that all of the working groups are doing. So thank you for that. Also, a massive thank you to both Betty and Tricia for considering joining us today. I believe Betty is representing the work from the White House today, and Tricia is unable to join. Meghan is going to be joining us from CLF. Betty, could I actually back up on the previous slide? Thank you, Kaylee. Could I ask you to introduce yourself?
Hello, all. Well, wonderful to be with you today. Yes, unfortunately, Tricia Miller is in the hard work of finalizing an EPA determination. The work here is always underway. We just put out a big building performance standard yesterday, so we're all in a mad dash to the end of the year, just like you. But I'm thrilled to be here representing the federal Buy Clean initiative and our work across the task force, and excited that we've been able to profile your strong work in our initiative and look forward to working ahead in the coming year.
Julie, you're muted.
Thank you, Kaylee. And thank you, Betty, for introducing yourself and for joining us. We're exceptionally grateful to have you here. Could I also ask Meghan, to introduce yourself.
So I will also unmute. Meghan Lewis, I'm a senior researcher at the Carbon Leadership Forum, and I've been leading our policy work since 2020, which has become a much bigger job every year, which is a good problem to have, joined now by 2 other members on our team focusing on policy.
Awesome, super. And with that, I would love to give the floor to you both. Who would like to take it first?
I'm happy to start because I think I'm going to try to give an overview, and then I
That would be
assume
great.
Betty will be able to give more of a deep dive.
Super.
So, oh, now my face is just very big on my screen. Okay.
That's all right. It's temporary.
All right, can y'all see the slides now?
Yep, all good.
Okay, great. All right, so today I'm going to give a short overview of types of policies, trying to stay at that high level overview of the whole landscape. I'll talk a little bit more in depth about bike clean and a couple of additional precedents that represent other policy approaches different from bike clean, and then have a few closing thoughts on MEP and embodied carbon policy, sort of pathways forward for this group. And before I give the presentation, just wanted to give a quick shout out to our Embodied Carbon educational series. And this is a 6-part series that covers in deeper content on everything I'm going to talk about today. And I used to be able to summarize the entirety of embodied carbon policy in one slide with federal, state, and local action. And I'm very happy to say that's no longer the case. But to stay up to date on what has been introduced, what has been passed, with a better focus on US, but also international policy, highly recommend our policy toolkit map. And we're trying to get improve in how fast we update this and make it more useful for our network over time. Oh, and there we go. So many of you have probably seen the top of this slide that highlights different strategies and tools for reducing embodied carbon and how those shift throughout the design process. The bottom of the slide is our attempt to map those strategies to policy precedents we're seeing. So in reality, all of these policy measures are influential across the whole design and construction process. But this issue of timing is why we've highlighted that certain policy measures are better suited to incentivize certain strategies. So for example, zoning, permitting, other city policy measures are target design teams early in the design process. And so they're better suited to incentivize strategies like adaptive reuse or use of emerging materials, anything that requires early coordination and design integration. But they can still have an impact on procurement, for example. On the flip side, we're seeing the most action on procurement policy by Clean, using EPDs as a tool to limit the embodied carbon of the highest impact industrial materials like concrete and steel. These policies are really important for creating a market for lower carbon products, but they do not incentivize building and material reuse or design optimization of buildings. So all that to say, there's a range of strategies for reducing embodied carbon, and we should celebrate a range of policy approaches that we'll also need over the coming years. So in addition to thinking about different types of policies, code, zoning, public procurement, this is sort of thinking about different levels of those policy or different policy instruments. At CLF, we've observed in the last few years, really there's been an amazing shift from this really being in more of the awareness and voluntary goals and certification space when we think about embodied carbon to now really shifting to the right side of the spectrum. So showing up in incentive programs, notably including a lot of the funding and IRA, and then also requiring disclosure of environmental and other data, as well as some regulatory approaches, through performance standards and other requirements. So while embodied carbon policy as a whole, I'd say, is shifting towards the right of the spectrum, I think y'all all here are aware that MEP is more still in this awareness and voluntary phase. I think with the exception of refrigerants, which I'm excited to see this group taking a lead on, but so I think there's a lot of room for it to move, down to the right towards where some of these other policies are heading. And my last sort of introductory slide I'll share is just highlighting the different opportunities at different levels of government. So I'm not going to focus on federal or IRA, but because we have Betty here today, who can do a much better job than me. But to give a few examples of how state and local policy is a really important complement to federal policy, states are responsible for development of road and other infrastructure construction. So, for example, a lot of the federal funding focused on transportation infrastructure and pavements in IRA is being passed to the states to implement. States also have greater control over building regulations, like building and energy codes, and are often testing grounds for federal and other climate policies, like we've seen with bike lane, starting in California. California is also an example where regulations that already address public procurement, so bike lane, California, now we're seeing a shift to also include private sector. So there's proposals for Cal Green to incorporate more stringent embodied carbon requirements, and AB 2446 was passed last year, which would also will lead to embodied carbon requirements for the private sector in the next few years. Local policies also have a really unique role because of their impact on design and construction, as I mentioned a little bit above, because of local zoning, land use, and other building regulations that are typically out of jurisdiction in the US for state and federal governments. And cities are also where the majority of new buildings are built. So that's obviously an important piece too. Cities are also the only place we've seen deconstruction requirements, and Marin County is an example of how they can be a testing ground for low carbon concrete code language that we're now seeing being proposed across the country. And similar to states, cities are also important testing grounds. So for example, Portland had our low carbon concrete policy, and now we're seeing state level bike lane in Oregon that really built on that strong foundation where there was already a higher level of awareness. Because of that policy, it made it easier to get passed. And one note, this slide and this sort of thinking is really relevant for the US and Canada, and not so much in less decentralized regions of the world. So for example, European national governments are able to control building regulations often in ways that in the US we can't do that. They have to be at the state or local level. And there are a number of initiatives led by the UN and other international groups to harmonize approaches, such as the IDDI working group in the UN and a couple other UN initiatives. And the US is in the excellent position of actually leading on clean procurement for building materials because of the federal Buy Clean initiative. And we have the opportunities to set the precedent for how other countries can pursue clean procurement. So going to dive a little deeper into Buy Clean. This is the most common type of clean procurement policy we're seeing in the US, and now started to be copied elsewhere globally. And it uses a combination of disclosure, so EPD reporting, GWP standards, so setting limits, and I'll show an example in a moment, on individual materials. And then some of these also include incentives, so tax rebates for manufacturers to produce EPDs or lower the carbon of materials, a lot of sort of education and outreach in that category. And the goal of this is really to leverage the purchasing power of public agencies to create a market for low carbon construction materials. And because Buy Clean is focused on EPDs, important to remind ourselves that's really focusing on industrial supply chains for materials. It's not focused at the building scale. And I'll talk more about some examples of building scale policies in the next section. And Buy Clean is an approach that can be used by all building owners. So federal, local, state building owners, but also private building owners. And I think private building owners were an important testing ground for this type of policy. So companies that are already integrating GWP limits into their specs, but obviously there's bigger opportunities for some things like incentives when you start to have the purchasing power of the federal government, for example. So this is an example of the GWP limits that are in Buy Clean California. So these are set at the industry average. These are all the industry, based on the industry-wide EPDs that are produced for each of these materials. And eligible products now have to demonstrate that they're below these limits highlighted in orange here as of July 2022, they have to demonstrate that by using an EPD. So the EPDs were initially required as disclosure, and now they're the reporting tool that shows that the materials on the project are meeting these limits. And by setting a limit at the industry average, California is trying to cut emissions from the worst polluters, but while still ensuring that meeting the policy is achievable for a typical manufacturer. So these will be reduced over time to continue to reflect the industry average every 3 years. There's additional approaches that we haven't yet seen that we may be seeing at the federal level. In the future, that would also have an additional standard that would be a low carbon standard, and that could either refer to a smaller scope of materials, a smaller scope of buildings, only a couple of projects, or over a really large budget size or square footage size, for example, would have to meet more stringent requirements. And so that would push it. This is really trying to cut out what we say, cutting the worst polluters, whereas having lower standards would really be trying to incentivize innovation. This is just a snapshot of the 2022 landscape. So Executive Order 14057, think of that as saying federal buy clean. And then I also left on here what failed in 2022. And the reason I did that is because we often see buy clean fail a couple of times, or once or twice before it becomes passed by states. And I think that's because there's a learning curve. The first time people hear about some of the elements in buy clean, they have no idea what an EPD is. And so then, the next year it comes into legislation, they're like, oh yeah, I remember this, I remember the goal, and then it's more likely to pass. So you don't have to have all of the education in addition to the necessary policy conversations that would follow. And what we think we may see is because of federal buy clean that some of that education will not be as necessary of a step. So maybe we'll see some of these start to pass a little faster. But at a minimum, I would expect the states that are new to this to continue to push for buy clean. That's what happened. And many of the other states that already have it is, again, failed the first year and then passed the second or third year. And the other thing you can see on this slide, so this is showing sort of this row is what materials are included, whether it includes buildings or also DOT projects, whether it requires disclosure. So all of them require disclosure, which is good to see. So all require EPDs for the included materials. Not all of them include standards. And so, for example, Washington is a reporting only bill that has failed the last few years. And then some say TBD because they have a technical advisory committee or working group that has to decide what the standards will be and when they are set. And then the last row here, incentives, that's what I mentioned. There's a really big range in what incentives means. And I think this has been a little harder for states to provide. They just don't have as much funding. So I think IRA fills a really important gap there with the funding for the EPA to focus on EPDs. And just a few thoughts on what we expect to see more of. So we, again, expect a lot more states to pass buy clean. Also want to emphasize this is not redundant with federal buy clean. Federal and state procurement are separate buckets of money, separate projects. And again, as I mentioned, the funding for things like making it, providing funding for manufacturers to get EPDs will, I think, just make it even easier for these policies to get passed. We also expect to see some expansion of scope in states that already have buy clean. And one that I included here that I've heard a lot come up in conversations that hasn't been included yet is aluminum. And so that's an interesting area to think about what that would mean for MEP products and how that would really work. I think that's one of the reasons it hasn't yet been included is because unlike saying, rebar or identifying, there are 4 types of structural steel that I had on that slide. This slide where, oh wow, okay, I went too fast. Okay, there we go. Where you can see here, there's discrete products. As you would all be very familiar, coming up with that list for aluminum could be a lot longer list. That doesn't mean it shouldn't happen, but it just requires a little more thought as to how to make that line up with the structure of buy clean. And then also just a reminder that while these policies have been passed, most of them are still in the reporting or sort of ramp up phase. And so in the next year or two, there'll be a lot more of actual requirements going into effect in terms of materials needing to meet GWP standards like those that I showed for California. And then, okay, I have a couple of minutes left. So just want to, I think I'll have time to cover everything. So one example I want to give of a building policy. This is a sort of classic example of a building policy that includes whole building LCA rather than EPDs as the reporting element. So Vancouver's green building policy for rezoning. So starting in 2017, they required teams to report the global warming potential of their projects per square meter as calculated using a whole building LCA. In 2022, they're working on setting the % reduction requirements. And this is one of those things where I have to say, I just came back from maternity leave. So I don't actually know if those have been set yet. I think they have. And then the last one here, informing new policies. they're incorporating those requirements into their building bylaws. So it's sort of growing from this one policy to affect more. And then this next one in a completely different direction, deconstruction and salvage. So Portland's deconstruction law is an example of this. So since 2020, houses and duplexes have to be fully deconstructed if they're built before 1940 or earlier. And you can see some of the analysis that went into this policy has to do with what can be salvaged, and it's softwood lumber is the most salvageable material. And that had a big carbon impact if that were able to be salvaged instead of rotting in a landfill. And particularly because of the wood used before 1940. And so I think this is an interesting thing just to think about for MEP, is whether there is an opportunity related to tenant improvements and some type of deconstruction policy. I have not seen an example of that, but I could see that being a shorter term possibility as things like EBDs and standardization of how to include MEP in whole building LCA are growing. And so, yeah, just a couple of closing thoughts. Really look forward to the thoughts of this group. I think this is a really great sort of brain trust to think about how MEP can start to show up in policy in terms of embodied carbon reductions. But I think the efforts in MEP 2040 are really critical on advancing MEP data. So growing EPDs, increased inclusion of whole building within whole building LCAs. I think there's an opportunity for refrigerants to be better represented in building policy. And I would be curious to hear from this group, whether there are things that I should be including in my sort of basic policy landscape for refrigerants. And then again, sort of, is there more short-term opportunities related to deconstruction and reuse for MEP and tenant improvements? And maybe we'll see local building regulations being an important testing ground to get started. But a little, and maybe I'll throw this to Ed Betty as she's about to start, is GSA's procurement and the funding that they have for the next few years also an opportunity to think about collecting MEP data or what embodied carbon requirements could look like for MEP. And with that, I will stop and see what questions were thrown in the chat, but I'm guessing we'll do that after.
Yeah, we will. Megan,
Okay.
Thank you so much. I think what I'd like to do is hand the mic over to Betty to share some thoughts as well, and we'll circle back on questions with the two of you after that.
Wonderful. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes,
Or is
thank
there like
you.
a weird gray bar? We have these weird security
There-
things.
Yeah, there is a gray bar, but the screen is good.
All right, I don't know how to get rid of it. Well, hopefully it won't block too much content. Here, we'll put it at the bottom. Thank you so much for having me. And just as a matter of housekeeping, thanks to wonderful White House restrictions, I cannot see the chat feature. So if anyone has sent me a chat, I'm not ignoring you. I just can't see it. Hopefully one of the moderators can read out questions to me.
Not a problem.
But thank you.
You got it.
It's a miracle we could get on Zoom. So thank you so much for having me, Megan. That was an incredible overview. It's so nice to sort of follow such a key setup. And I just was taking notes on some of the things you mentioned. So hopefully we can update some of your slides very rapidly as the work of the Buy Clean Task Force and our agencies across the federal government really implement this work and take it to action. So it's wonderful to be with you. As I mentioned, Tricia Miller and Andrew Mayock, our co-chairs of our Buy Clean Task Force, are unable to join us, but I lead a lot of the work day to day on Buy Clean. So hopefully I can represent all of the work across the US federal government and all of our partners and get you inspired to collaborate with us in the coming year. So I'm sure this is all sort of background for you, but we know across the federal government that we need to have a really strong focus on industrial decarbonization. We know in the past these things have been considered the hard to abate sectors, and in order to achieve all of our ambitious net zero emissions goals, both for our nation as well as our own federal procurement, we really need to focus on decarbonization of these tough industries and really making sure we're focusing on investing here in the US, investing in the industry as well as the people who make these products. And so a lot of our focuses are on Made in America, good paying jobs to generate these materials that we know are necessary not only to invest in our existing infrastructure, but to build the clean infrastructure of the future. So we have a whole variety of policies that we're working on economy-wide to achieve our net zero emissions goals. And as I mentioned, this includes the industrial sector. So DOE and other agencies are hard at work with investments in R&D and deployment, in regulations around many of the emissions sources of importance to the industrial sector, trade policies so that we're in lockstep with our partners and are putting US industry at a competitive advantage where we're relevant. And then specifically where I work, and as we've been discussing around the role of Buy Clean, is getting out ahead with our procurement and sending that demand signal through markets. So the federal Buy Clean policy has been built sort of learning from all of the states and cities and local governments that have come ahead of us, our other international friends who are also thinking about embodied carbon in their own procurement. And we've been really proud to sort of get this out the door and get this out and moving. So we, as the US federal government, where I sit in the office of the Federal Chief Sustainability Officer, we oversee how the federal government buys, builds, and operates. We are the largest landowner in the US. We're the largest energy buyer in the US. We have the largest vehicle fleet in the US. We're moving all of those towards zero carbon sources. And then we are also the world's largest buyer of goods and services. We spend about $630 billion a year. And we've done the math. Roughly, we know that emissions for the production of the goods and services for our supply chain, emissions are about twice the size of our own direct emissions from vehicles and buildings. And those are both massive numbers. So it's both an impact and a really strong opportunity. We also know we rely on these goods and services to build our infrastructure. And so this Buy Clean initiative is the first time we're ever sending a demand signal through our procurement to prioritize lower embodied carbon construction materials. And as I mentioned, really a strong focus on Made in America labor jobs throughout both our procurement as well as our federally funded projects. So as Megan mentioned, I won't go into it, but Executive Order 14057 around federal sustainability launched exactly a year ago, I believe today. And so this was, along with many other taskings, it tasked us to stand up a Buy Clean task force to prioritize all of the opportunities listed below. But a lot of this stuff was actually already underway across government. And so we've been able to sort of build upon that momentum and catalyze some action within the past year, with a lot more to come over the coming year. So there were 3 key recommendations we put out back in September when we launched the Buy Clean initiative. These were recommendations around critical materials to focus on, pollutants, as well as mechanisms for collecting data. So Megan went into a lot of this. We looked across what states were doing, what others were doing, where EPDs were, where the data products were, where we need to work to help standardize and improve for procurement purposes. And for the first round of Buy Clean, so this is just phase 1, we've prioritized 4 key materials: concrete and the cement that goes into it, steel, all steel products, flat glass and its applications in window installations, as well as asphalt. These represent about 98% of federal expenditure in construction materials, according to some very old data that we have. Megan noted the lack of aluminum. It's definitely on our list of the next phase of materials. We don't see it as a high spend in federal procurement, but we understand it's really critical and a really strong opportunity to invest in American manufacturing as well. So fear not, it's on the horizon. In terms of pollutants, we know there are a whole variety of key pollutants that both lead to climate change, environmental degradation, and also human health impacts. And we looked across, particulate matter and chemicals and all sorts of other issues. We've decided to prioritize greenhouse gas emissions with the first phase of Buy Clean, understanding that there are many other pollutants that we want to be focusing on when we think about these materials. But we're sort of over-indexing on greenhouse gas emissions towards our federal net zero procurement goal, with the recognition of other key concerns in this space as well. And then, as mentioned, EPDs really are our primary data product. We know that they work now. We can begin to capture them. We're already capturing them for many procurements. And we also know, as the federal government, there are a multitude of ways we can lean in to help standardize the product category rules and the life cycle analysis data that goes into it, the industry averages, the digitization of these data products, so that we can have much more transparency and accountability and sort of minimize the burden of disclosure and maximize the effort on decarbonization, which is what we're all after. So we put out these recommendations knowing there's a lot of work ahead, but this all builds on the existing sort of groundswell that we're seeing in the marketplace. after the executive order came out, we also had the Inflation Reduction Act passed. And so we've been tracking all of the funding that's come through the IRA to various agencies to sort of jumpstart and accelerate this work. Megan sort of touched on a few of these, but the sort of 4 key ones we're looking at across Buy Clean are the $2.15 billion for the GSA, to focus on procuring and installing lower embodied carbon materials and products in federal buildings. They're already hard at work on all of the land border port of entry crossings that actually have funding through the bipartisan infrastructure law. And now this funding can sort of hyper accelerate the next phase. And we're working really closely with GSA. And I think it will be relevant to this group to think about the embodied carbon emissions of the materials they're selecting, as well as the operational emissions of the buildings and the facilities themselves, and sort of making sure that we're balancing the need to focus on emissions throughout all life cycle stages of the built environment. The Federal Highways Administration and Department of Transportation also has been well underway on this work. The Sustainable Pavements Program has been going on for over 12 years. They got a jumpstart of $2 billion additional dollars to distribute to state Department of Transportations for lower embodied carbon construction materials. So this is a really critical acceleration of their work. EPA received 2 lines of funding, one of $100 million to develop a program at EPA to identify and label lower embodied carbon construction materials. And then another $250 million to provide technical and financial assistance to everyone in the marketplace that we know will need to be providing these EPDs. And so you should look out for some RFIs helping inform that work as well. And then more on the supply side, we've seen there's about $15 billion for Department of Energy to help invest in the facilities themselves to make those retrofits necessary to begin to produce these lower carbon materials. And then we are really excited that both HUD and FEMA now are considering lower emissions materials in their grant making as well. And that will help us get into the residential housing area and other community investments that really align with our environmental justice objectives as well. So lots of money infused into the system. And if you notice on the right, most of them have 4 years to spend it. So if you work in construction, you know how hard it is to reconcile 4 years of funding and long-term construction projects. So we are getting started right away. Buy Clean it's really exciting to get it off the ground and launched at a federal level. And we've seen great reception from the marketplace, maybe thanks to Megan and all of the work that you guys have all done to lay all that groundwork. So we launched the Federal Buy Clean Initiative back in September in Toledo, Ohio, at a direct reduction steel plant, highlighting United Steelworkers and the opportunity to make investments here in America to produce these materials. We had Secretary Buttigieg from the Department of Transportation, Administrator Carnahan from the General Services Administration, and Ali Zaidi, the Federal Climate Director. And we had really great reception in the media for this important work. We also had industry groups, environmental groups, all sort of celebrating this opportunity. So it's nice to see that our money is going to very excited partners. We've also been working to make sure that we have other demand players in this work. And so as Megan mentioned, there's been a groundswell of work across states. We are honored to bring together 20 states from across the US at a convening at the White House. These are some states who already had Buy Clean initiatives well underway: California, Washington, Colorado, Hawaii, et cetera. And then other states that were in the learning mode and starting to think about their policies, learning to how we can align so that we're setting similar standards at a federal and state level. And also, as all this IRA funding is flowing to states, how we can make sure that we're aligned in that work as well. This time, we also announced that the Department of Transportation's Climate Challenge had selected 25 states to receive funding to support their work on EPDs and sustainable pavements. And a lot of states that were not represented at this meeting, I will say, received funding. And so it was a great way to make sure that we're celebrating the work across the entire United States and all of our states and local government partners. And we're not stopping there. We're really working with international partners in establishing our Buy Clean policies. So as already mentioned, we've done the Industrial Deep Decarbonization Initiative to make sure that we're aligning on these data products and procurement mechanisms with our international partners. We're also working through the State Department, which is working with the First Movers Coalition at the World Economic Forum. This is an initiative to have advanced market commitments for near and net zero materials. So while we're trying to get maybe a 20% reduction in some of these materials, they're looking for these near and net zero materials to jump up the learning curve and the R&D curve so that we can start to procure them at the scale of government. And so we're really excited to begin to reconcile these two and shorten the distance between what we currently buy and what we could be buying in the near future. This is just like a whirlwind tour of all the work we're doing across Buy Clean. Many agencies are way out ahead of us on integrating this into procurement. Just yesterday, the General Services Administration announced the first contract for a land border port of entry crossing in California for low embodied carbon concrete. So that's money flowing out the door, putting Buy Clean into practice. We'll see a lot more over the coming months as the other agencies begin to implement on this, and the Department of Defense really moves on this as well, especially through the Army Corps of Engineers. So probably a whole lot more to say, but I think I'll leave it at that and turn it back to you guys.
Amazing, thank you. So what I'd like to do is spend a few minutes asking some questions that feel like they're relevant to most of us on the call. We do have some really great questions that have been put in the chat, and we're going to follow up on those as well. To kick us off, I think the first question that I'd like to ask is how the federal government is, and actually for both of you, Meghan, across the policies that you guys have been tracking and supporting, and Betty, the federal scale with the Buy Clean initiative, who's in the room in determining what counts as a quote unquote building product? How do you see MEP products starting to come into that conversation, either at the scale of something like refrigerants or building systems, all the way up to, infrastructural scale projects, and where do you see that happening in the near term, and how could a group like this help support that happening perhaps more quickly?
Betty, do you want to go first?
Yeah, go ahead. I'll jump in after.
Well, first I'd say a lot of times I see CLF members in the room. I see architects, designers, engineers, contractors influencing the scope of some of the state and local policies. And I think some of that is impacted by who is leading the policy development. So, what organization, for example, Blue-Green Alliance has played a really big role in helping advance some of the state Buy Clean policies and has helped gather stakeholders to have input. And then I think in terms of the scope, it's high impact and then high spend, as Betty mentioned. And so I think there needs to be more awareness of where MEP fits on that. And I think, we at CLF have been trying to help that for a while, putting MEP on people's radar. But I think there's still a lot of work to be done. I don't know that people realize that a lot of times when they see the numbers and see concrete and steel at the top, that a lot of times structure is the only thing included, and it doesn't include MEP. And so that's one of the reasons I feel like aluminum will be a little bit of a gateway, because it's on the top 5 list. If you look at global industrial emissions, even though it's not as big of a spend for governments, that it still will be, I think, around renewable energy infrastructure. In particular, I've heard a lot of interest related to aluminum.
I think that's a really critical point, Megan. So thank you for making it. I would say a few things. So when you look at like the big kahuna of emissions and industrial emissions and what we're buying, steel and cement just rise straight to the top. And we know that there's a long pathway to decarbonizing those industries. And it's not just we can't just electrify it and put up some renewables in there and call it decarbonized. And so there's a lot of industrial processes and major multi-billion dollar investments that need to be made in these facilities. And we need to show a demand signal that we will actually buy those materials to make it worth the while to make those investments. So I think that's why we've started with those types of materials. We also know at a cost level, though, those are cheap, right? And so if we look at cost for a building, we have to think about a much broader system. So a lot of federal agencies are really taking a whole project or a whole building life cycle analysis approach, thinking about all sorts of design considerations in siting, in permeability, in adaptive reuse, in salvage, as Megan was saying, to really completely decarbonize our built environment towards our net zero buildings goal. And with that, there are alternative material selections that can be made, like structural wood products, for example. And then once you're stuck using the dirty materials like concrete and steel, that's where a buy clean policy comes in. So we're really making sure that it's contextualized within a much broader strategy of working on both operational carbon of the use phase, but really the embodied carbon as well. So it's definitely within a whole project. What I will say is that GSA's RFI on materials look not just at our 4 top, but our 9 critical materials that they're thinking about including. So things like insulation, structural wood were included in that. And actually, as we thought about that, we thought about things like mechanical systems, but we realized there's just no EPDs available. So this is a bit of a chicken and an egg situation where if we don't have EPDs and data products on the market to understand the embodied carbon, we don't know how to ask for the data products and work to reduce the embodied carbon. So I would encourage every both product and material in buildings to consider accounting for emissions so that we can sort of broaden the spectrum. The first move I've seen is the EPEAT standard has started to include embodied carbon for photovoltaic panels. So PV systems now are thinking about embodied carbon. And so I expect to see that expand. And as Megan mentioned, to both the products, but the materials as well. So any product that includes these materials will be part of this strategy. I guess the moral of the story is get started so that we can start to demand it and reduce it.
Yeah, you are preaching to the choir for sure. It's sort of a perfect segue to what we will talk about at the end of this conversation, which is a very brief overview of the first quarterly forum that we're holding after the new year. And the focus there is with manufacturers to get updates from the biggest ones, hopefully in our industry, that are starting to put EPDs together and publish them. And the push on the group that's on the call now and everybody who's been supporting the MEP 2040 initiative is really to start to ask for them, so that the more they get the request, the more they know that people are really starting to demand it and need it. I think it's also really, really good. So I'm really excited that something like insulation does show up on the top list, because we all know on this call that the more we account for climate specificity and a robust envelope to reduce heating and cooling loads in the first place, less material is less embodied carbon, right? Rule number 1. So the smaller the systems are, the better as a starting place across the board. There's I think a really clearly related topic here on what you were both talking about is around accountability. And again, this is for both of you at the scale of, Megan, what you've been seeing, again, the policy the CLF is supporting and reviewing, and Betty for the White House and the Buy Clean initiative. What's the ideal situation from your perspective on how accountability would happen in terms of permitting, regulatory review, who's reviewing it, how are they essentially coached or taught to understand what to look for, what's being submitted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So what's the ideal scenario, and what do you see happening in the near term if it's not the ideal scenario?
I can start again if you want. So a couple of examples, and I put a link in the chat for those of you who can see that our implementing Buy Clean report from last January highlights a couple of these. I'll focus on 2. So Washington State, we actually just wrapped up this project, developed a reporting database as part of their pilots, and that would all the data, including EPDs, would be submitted to that database. And so that is an example, I think, of an ideal where it's collected in one place. California is doing a spreadsheet version of that because, again, so DGS is the implementing agency for or they're the ones who have to set the limits, but then 8 or 9 different agencies are building the projects. And so right now, that is each of them is implementing on their own. And then DGS is asking them to collect that data so they can look at it holistically, because they have to have a report to the legislature. So something like the database is a step towards what I would say is more ideal, of having it easier to collect and track. Portland's program, because of the way they have a sort of pre-approved list of concrete mixes. And so in order to be on that list, you had to have an EPD that for that product that was below the GWP limits that they set. And so that's a pretty straightforward. Anytime there's a pre-approved product mix, which is more common in public procurement, then that is your compliance requirement. So I think that also works really well.
Yeah, and I would say that I think as we roll this out across government, each agency is learning from each other and sort of snowballing. It's very cheesy, but we talk a lot about pilots in government, which sometimes pilots happen at a pretty massive scale, but it's just a pilot. And now GSA is talking about pilots to pathfinders. So a lot of our agency partners are really thinking about how they request EPDs and track EPDs, and not just ask for the data, but then track compliance, that the materials they received actually did follow the data that they anticipated, and that the performance of the materials played out as it was intended to throughout the entire construction process. And so each agency is sort of learning from each other and then expanding what they've learned as actually establish specifications across just standard construction practice. So GSA has already put out, I believe it's the PS 100 standard. Admittedly, a little like email us a PDF right now, but we're examining all of the ways that through EPA we can partner with industry and with nonprofit partners, and all the work already going on standardizing, really digitizing EPDs, because we really feel like the making sure that data flow happens in a streamlined fashion will enable much more tracking of this data and really like procurement ready decision making off of it. And so we are really enthused by anyone doing any work to digitize and standardize the data products, especially because the data needs to flow through multiple stages of the supply chain. And we want to make sure that it maintains its accuracy and its integrity, and that the hotspot data actually stays with it. And it isn't just defaulting to industry averages as information gets transferred. So I would say GSA has gotten us started, as well as Department of Transportation, and then groups like FEMA and HUD are quickly learning because they're just distributing funding and they really need even more transparency through that data flow. I'm really enthused to watch the space of the Department of Defense. They take a while to do things, they do it in their own way, and when they do it, it comes out in a big way. So I have seen some hints of work happening at a pilot level, at an Army Corps of Engineers training level, as well as just working through their academics and their universities and their laboratories to make sure that this is truly just the new way of doing business. I think they said this is no longer a science experiment, this is just construction. So watch the space.
That is awesome. And a follow-up question on that, in terms of just sort of related to how you were describing everything. There's at Greenbuild this year, TallyCat was unveiled, right, as an open source tool. There are a number of other organizations that have developed open source tools. Folks like Payette, the firm that my firm, and there are lots of folks who are working on open source tools, in addition to EC3 as an open and transparent database. So there's a really big push for making sure that all of that information is available. Luke asked a really good question in the chat around the question of maintaining a database of the actual information as it is collected. So CBEX is a sort of corollary on the operational carbon side. Can you imagine that there would start to be an opportunity for a similar type of database that's actually collected at the federal national scale on the embodied carbon side?
I guess I need to go first on this one. Thanks, Megan. Yeah, so I would say when the executive order came out this time a year ago, we were doing everything with existing funding, and we did have some bipartisan infrastructure law funding to implement some of the projects. But as you might imagine, our friends at the Environmental Protection Agency were still operating on a shoestring. However, they have now received quite an infusion of money to establish these types of programs. And so I would say, I don't want to get ahead of them. They're well underway determining what the role of federal government is in setting standards and establishing what we're looking for, especially for procurement, and working with industry groups, nonprofits, partners, states, cities, all sorts of groups to determine what's out there and where they can be partnering. So watch this space for solicitations for information, for RFIs from them to determine how to build this program and what the role of federal government is and what the role of our partners is to sort of just catalyze the efforts underway. I think we don't want to stop any of this momentum. We want to be catalytic in it. And I would just say, I've been thinking quite a lot about the role of federal government in not just collecting and standardizing the data, but helping underpin the data with life cycle analysis and industry averages that can be really fully credible and everyone can build off the same playbook. So if you have ideas, not just on the data, the output data, but the input data, please bring it to us. I've learned about the life cycle analysis commons, the LCA commons at federal government that I didn't know existed till I joined, and it's very nascent, but it has a lot of agricultural data and some asphalt data. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to be helping standardize data across the full life cycle of the data itself.
Awesome. Well put. And Stephanie Carlisle very helpfully reminds us that the request is not just for EPDs, but for a database of whole building LCA results, right? So that we can really make sure we're always looking at things holistically and being able to account for the synergies and trade-offs.
I love that. I would just add not just whole building, but whole project, because a lot of our work with, maybe not with this sector, but with the broader Buy Clean initiative is for pavements and broader infrastructure. So we're looking both at the built environment as well as all of the pavements that we put in place to surround it, right? Because concrete is the most ubiquitous man-made material on Earth, and we can work to address that.
Yeah, I agree. We should probably swap the phrase whole building for whole project. It's a good point. There was one more question that I wanted to ask, and then we'll open it up to the floor. Kaylee, you asked a question about any emphasis on producing EPDs for MEP equipment within the IRA funding. I think that was asked, but I was wondering if you wanted to add anything to that.
So to my read, the IRA funding does not specify which products and materials we are focusing on. It does specify the types of data, looking at EPDs and other data sources, and what we need to do to help standardize them, digitize them, like we've been discussing, and the fact that we need to not just focus on embodied carbon, but substantially lower embodied carbon. And we're actually having a lot of discussions across government right now of what substantially lower means and what we could actually feasibly require from the industry for federal procurement. So what is at a scale that we can buy right now and how we can move the market forward. So we're focused on those aspects. As I mentioned, GSA has put out their list for RFI for information of what's available on a list of 9 materials. But I only expect that list to grow as we learn more and are integrating it into our systems. So IRA doesn't designate specific materials, but agencies will.
Yep. Super. Yeah, we had actually, the steering committee put some questions together, and one of the questions that we had sort of prepped was, how does CEQ define a low carbon material? So I like that what you're actually talking about is how do we define a substantially lower carbon material? I think that's an even better question. I lied. I'm actually going to ask one more question and then open it up to the floor. I hope that's okay. The Justice 40 initiative is impressive, right? And incredibly inspirational. And I hope we can all start to see how it's actually being accounted for in all of the work that's being done. I think there's a huge amount of attention on the IRA funding and how much money there is flowing into the agencies. It's unclear how, at least to me, maybe not to everybody, but I think that the Justice 40 initiative sort of feels like it's behind the scenes at the moment. And it would be great to hear from both of you on how you're seeing that come into play at the federal scale, obviously, but then what does that flow down look like into states and municipalities, and how does this work impact that conversation? Because embodied carbon is ultimately about the manufacturing processes and pollution related to that, and vulnerable communities, et cetera, right? They're so intricately related that it would be great to hear how you're seeing that either start to, or people, how are people considering that as part of this work?
I'll start, and then Megan can tell me what else. Yeah. Why don't I start, Megan? You can tell me what else we should be thinking about as we think through this. So I completely agree. Environmental justice is maybe behind the scenes because it's just becoming embedded in our work and it's not this sort of standalone thing. Maybe it's sort of like embodied carbon and green things are now just becoming standard practice. So maybe they don't need to have a program and a label soon too. They're just the default, let's hope. But I would say, you know, we think about environmental justice throughout all of the administration's priorities. And specifically relating to Buy Clean, I mean, it's in at least 3 areas. It's in the production of these materials, so the industrial manufacturing and the fence line communities surrounding historical industrial production, as well as new investments in industry. It's in the application of the materials themselves, as we build the buildings, but also infrastructure, renewable energy infrastructure, electric vehicles, new high energy electrical lines to transmit all of this new power that all need these embodied carbon materials, et cetera. And then in the actual investment in infrastructure. So there's a huge emphasis on environmental justice as we think about HUD and FEMA and federal highways and all the ways that our funding flows to states and cities and tribal nations and territories to make sure that we're investing in all sorts of communities, especially those that have been historically disinvested in. I actually had an industry group say to me, as you think about sustainable pavements, make sure you're putting the good, clean stuff in disadvantaged communities because they need to be benefiting the most from our investments in infrastructure. And I love that came from industry. So I would say it's embedded throughout. I don't see it showing up in an EPD, maybe not yet, except and we're hoping that we can add more sort of human health implications into our considerations of these materials. But yeah, environmental justice is just sort of part of how we're distributing all of our funding and establishing all of our programs. Megan, what have we not thought about?
Oh, no, I was just going to add some examples of things that we're already seeing. So I think there's a lot of interest in expanding to not just global warming potential. So those of you who have looked at EPDs and done whole building LCA, it's not the only report, or it's not the only impact reported. And so that's a potential pathway for that. There are other ways for that to happen. Washington has also asked people to report HPDs if they're available, as another example of how they're trying to think about how to incorporate other impacts besides carbon. And Washington State has also, part of the reason it's had trouble passing is because it's Buy Clean, Buy Fair. And so there are working condition reporting requirements that have received a lot of pushback. And what their goal is that when they do set requirements, they're requiring carbon limits, but also be able to say that new jobs created to produce low carbon materials are good jobs. And that's a different issue, but I think there's a lot of interest in tying workforce development and thinking about how to improve some of the communities that have been impacted, like in terms of providing more jobs or other resources. And that hasn't really made it into precedents. But so those are just examples of how people are beginning to start to think about it. I think there's a lot of interest and not a lot of clear language yet, I'll say.
That makes a lot of sense.
If I could just add one more thing.
Please do.
I did a quick Google. I mentioned that GSA has awarded its first contract for low embodied carbon concrete at a border port of entry crossing yesterday. It was in the news. And the selection was OCS Construction Services, which is a small disadvantaged business in Riverside, California. So I would say even in the contractors themselves, we're making sure we consider all of the agencies and the administration's priorities.
Awesome. Super, thank you. I'm going to swap over to a couple questions that have been in the chat from everyone, and also just open it up. If you do have a question, feel free to also continue to put it in the chat or raise your hand. Kaylee Levine, apologize if I said that wrong, asked if you could elaborate more on how Buy Clean applies to private versus public projects. Kaylee, do you want to add anything to that question?
Nope, good pronunciation, and yeah, that's just the gist of it. Thanks.
I think the private sector version is often setting limits in specifications. So that's one example. I think there's also been a lot more of using the bid process to try to reduce embodied carbon in the private sector, which New York has been trying to get into, has been trying to push through the LECLA legislation, and then they had another name for the most recent one. But basically saying that you have to compete on cost and carbon when you're bidding for a project. And I've heard some concerns from from state governments just in how they would implement that. I think some of the questions in the chat get at this, like, okay, we understand the overview, but what does it actually look like for accountability and implementation? And there's been some fear about doing that in the public sector so far. But anyway, so private sector, just more room for experimentation.
Yeah, I would just add that we have been benchmarking quite a lot from the private sector, but also quite inspired and hope to be able to inspire more. So we were thrilled that we were able to include your announcement or your commitment in our most recent White House fact sheet, but heads up to look for the space in the coming year. We're really going to be looking to inspire a lot more corporate demand side commitments for low embodied carbon materials throughout all of their value chains as well. And to Megan's point, ways that the private sector can maybe be even more experimental than us. One way I would point to in that is the First Movers Coalition, which are companies who are making these advanced market commitments to maybe pay very high rates for really exciting new near and net zero materials, and they have a whole variety of sectors under consideration. We're thinking about how we as government could make that type of advanced market commitment and having pushback. So I think the private sector is able to showcase a lot of these new materials and help bring that R&D curve up to scale that we can maybe begin to purchase it at our level. So lots of important learnings from the private sector right alongside the public sector, and also really important to get geographical distribution of this. So to Megan's point, the states that have come ahead of us have helped concentrate the ability to produce EPDs and produce embodied carbon considerations in those regions, but there are a lot of other regions where we need to buy this stuff. So working with the private sector can make sure we have broad geographical distribution and awareness. It's a lot easier to work with a contractor who already knows about this than to have to educate them on the job.
And one other thing that I do want to add, because I know the scope of most of the existing buy, clean, and procurement focuses on EPDs. Private sector has focused a lot more on whole building LCA. And some of the other strategies that I described in my presentation. So don't want to fall into only talking about EPDs because we're talking about procurement. But again, private sector has been doing a lot more of that. And I think part of the reason that we haven't seen more of that in public sector is because of the standardization of whole building LCA not being at the same place. But hopefully that will change soon.
Super. Thank you, ladies. Kaylee from Vera Happold, also MEP 2040 Steering Committee Co-Chair. Can I give you the mic to ask your question?
Sure. I saw that Randall had posted a link to Design for Freedom, and I think the point he was probably trying to make is, what are the considerations for other impacts? So healthy materials, so we don't want to promote a material like PVC, low embodied carbon, high health impacts, or the ethical sourcing of certain materials. I know that just looking at some US Census data, we don't import cobalt from the DRC, things like that. But how are we considering all of those impacts when we are now so focused on environmental impacts?
Well, I gave one example of that. So just including additional requirements in Buy Clean. So I think because Buy Clean focuses on specific materials, one of the benefits of that is that you can have more specific, you can tie that. So, if there were procurement requirements for products, including cobalt, you could include those types of requirements more easily because you're requiring supply chain disclosure. And that has just really been a really big gap that this is trying to address, is transparency throughout the supply chain, not just for carbon, but for other impacts. So if you're going to require transparency about embodied carbon, you can tie other things to that. So.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. This Buy Clean initiative is the very first time the federal government has ever given any type of differentiation to these products in the marketplace, and also ask the industry for what is available and what could be available. And so to Megan's point, it's the first, not the last, it's the beginning, and it can unlock the opportunity to really focus on not just additional criteria, but additional criteria throughout the value chain, and we'll be able to have that transparency and accountability that we've never seen before.
Haley, anything to add?
No, I think that's a great answer. I think that it's a stepping stone into many other things, right? An EPD digs down into your supply chain, so why not make that data transparent as part of the reporting?
Yeah, Betty and Megan, are you guys aware of the Design for Freedom effort that's happening. Cool. So that I think the healthy materials databases that are out there, plus the Design for Freedom activity, means that there really is an opportunity to start to look at all of those at the same time, so that we're not selecting something that's good in one category and terrible in another, right? I think it comes back to a conversation that we were having at the very, very beginning, which is how do we bring Architecture 2030, MEP 2040, SE 2050 together, right? For a holistic understanding. The same question exists on data. How do we bring all of the best data that's available together so that we can make holistic conversations? I was wondering if I could pass the mic to Mike Grinick, who's one of the founders of the SE 2050 initiative and a really important friend in this space, and wanted to just give him the opportunity for a minute.
Thank you, Julie. I actually was going to sort of echo what you were talking about with, how can we help the federal government in what we're doing with these initiatives, right? So, we're sort of over here and we're feeling very excited about what we're doing, right? And then you have the purse, so to speak, and you're sending all these market signals out there with procurement, which is fantastic. What we've been thinking about at SE 2050 lately is, for a while we were like, oh, we need to provide the industry the appropriate benchmarks, right? And then they can run with that. What we're finding, because things are happening so fast, there are so many different groups that are trying to create the benchmark, right? And so we are kind of leaning towards, we want to provide the profession more the trends, and then we can take everyone else's benchmarks and plot them against our data, instead of trying to spend a lot of energy convincing everybody that our benchmark is the best one and they should follow this one. So I guess like within the spirit of MEP 2040, and then what we're doing at 2050, and then the 2030 folks on the embodied carbon side, what is it that we can do for you, Betty, and the people at the White House to help signal boost this, right? We have a lot of questions. I have a lot of questions about EPDs. Okay, so then there's a lot of issues with the background data and all that kind of stuff, and don't want to get into that right now. But so as you sit here as an important representative of the federal government, what can our organizations do to help to support you?
Oh my goodness, everything you've mentioned and more. So yes, I agree. I think it's been really interesting to watch the other states that Meghan talked about sort of come out of the gate with their global warming potentials and then work to build the programs around that. And I think if you've noticed, we've been pretty intentional at the federal level to build the program around it as we work towards thresholds and global warming potentials. So we're really all about transparency and accountability and requesting the data and disclosure and figuring out how through pilots we can integrate this into various aspects of our procurement specs for construction. And with that, determining the benchmarks based off the data availability that we have. And so it's always been going to be an iterative process as we do that to see what data is available to understand where we can put benchmarks to then hopefully accelerate. So, GS8 came out of the gate with their, I believe it's a 20%, EPDs, and then a 20% reduction for concrete, and then at least 2 environmentally preferable attributes for asphalt, because that was where they could see the market being able to provide it when they put out their RFI about a couple months ago. I anticipate that to completely change in the next few months and to just be the baseline, the floor, not the ceiling. So that's to say that's all based on what we know we can receive from the industry. So anything you can do to educate, inspire, provide more data, provide more knowledge of this. Supply chains are supposed to flow in the other direction. Like, suppliers are supposed to be telling us all the great stuff that they can provide to us, but in this case, we kind of have to push it into our supply chain to start to put these demands. So hopefully the information can be flowing in a much more bi-directional fashion as we go ahead, and as we think about these sort of multi-dimensional aspects that we've all been discussing today. It's not just carbon, it's all these other considerations as well. And so, yeah, I think everything you've done to sort of establish education and knowledge and awareness and data and improving the data can only help us all go faster together. And then look out for all the RFIs and requests for information coming. They really do inform our thinking. So GSA has been actively reviewing all the responses they received to their RFI on materials. EPA will be putting out their RFI soon on technical assistance and financial assistance programs, as well as how they're establishing their embodied carbon considerations and labeling programs. So make sure it's a dialogue with our agencies.
So very quick follow-up. Thank you very much, Betty. And by the way, it's nice to meet you. Would it help you if organizations like the 2040, 2050, 2030 created some kind of I don't know, liaison or some sort of point person, so you're not trying to, like, you're getting information maybe in a more coalesced way, because we're trying to signal boost our own efforts, and maybe there's a way to, we don't need to work this out on this call right now, but it's just a thought, because you might, I have to imagine you're sitting there and there's just like all of this information is coming at you, and you know,
isn't that such a bonus? That's such a brilliant opportunity to have. Yes, I mean, this is what we've all been working our careers for. At least I've been working my career for, is the implementation phase, right? Not the convincing folks why this matters, but the projects, the implementation. So yeah, this is the exciting opportunity, and where we need to all be collaborating and sort of making sure we're focusing together. So yeah, as I mentioned, we've been really working to convene other demand signal players, so states and increasingly industrial players or corporate consumers. We also want to make sure we have long commitments from the production side, the manufacturing side, investing in near and net zero materials and manufacturing, as well as all the players throughout the value chain, architects, engineers, MEP. Everybody needs to be involved in this. Even you know, some of those building performance standards folks and some of those engineers out in the field. So I think we want to make sure this is like a really unified approach, and that as the federal government, we're signaling from the top, but that everybody is lining up to support. So please reach out.
Thank you, and thank you, Julie, for the opportunity.
And just to note, we'll do our best to amplify whenever RFIs are put out. We will share them on the CLF network, and you know, I'll add it to my mental note to send it to MEP 2040 and SE 2050 leaders to make sure that you have a chance to put that on your radar.
Awesome, Megan, that would be very helpful. We do have some additional time for more questions from everyone on the call. Does anyone want to put their hand up or take yourself off mute? I took a pass at making sure that we were answering the questions in the chat, but certainly don't want to think I did without checking with you all first. All right, that looks like a no. Betty, Megan, cannot thank you enough for joining us today. We've just got a few other updates for everyone to share. Kaylee, if you wouldn't mind bringing back up your slide, our slides, we'll walk through those. And then if anybody does think of any questions, we'll have a few more minutes at the end. But please do continue to follow up in the chat or within the working groups. Super. So Kaylee, could I give you the mic for the working group roundup?
Sure. I'll actually pass off to the individual chairs as we go through here, if that's all right. So for manufacturers and EPDs, I believe Adam or Christy will be covering.
Yes, Adam. So yeah, in our working group, we have something we'll talk about later in terms of our next quarterly forum and some of our engagement with the manufacturers there. Otherwise, what we're working on is spec language templates that we're going to present at that forum, which we'll talk about. And then in the past, we've published the refrigerant and EPD template letters, which were talked about on this call. And those are available on our website, so that we all are asking our manufacturers for the data that we want, all in the same way. And so those are out there available on the MEP 2040 website. And then we will continue with doing monthly meetings in 23 for the working group.
Thanks, Adam. For the data analytics and reporting group, it's myself and Kim Shin who are currently leading that group. So this past year, we were able to deliver the refrigerant impact calculator. Again, was mentioned at the beginning of the call, but really just highlighting those impacts in a nice friendly way for us to be able to go through, attach some data sets together and perform a calculation to determine how much GWP our refrigerants are contributing to our buildings. On a similar note, we've established a relationship with the 2030 DDX committee to be able to report refrigerants. That is our goal, that we are able to add, in addition to the operational emissions that are already reported through DDX, attaching refrigerant emissions. So that's something that we've started a conversation on. Obviously, that's a step toward us reporting MEP embodied carbon emissions as part of that whole building LCA. So that relationship has been established. We've also, there's a letter up there to reach out to mechanical contractors for schematic design level bills of materials, understanding what the MEP embodied carbon ask is from that perspective from a contractor. So there's a letter we've produced in that space. We will be transitioning our working group management to Ante Vulin and Corey Duggan. We're very excited. They've been very active working group members and they'll do a great job leading the group coming up in 2023. And our next working group meeting is the 21st of December. So look out for invites on that. Let me hand it over to Rob for communications and resources.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Kaylee. Well, it has been a very busy 2022 for the Communications and Resources Working Group. We've had a number of folks participating. We do want to request, I think for all of our working groups, additional participation from our signatories out there. So if you have folks that are interested in desirous of being very active in participation, please reach out to us to continue and help us to not only continue the momentum, but accelerate what we're trying to do. We have, within the MEP working group, developed a signatories membership and social media toolkit that is available on the website for our signatories to utilize. And this is to really help with messaging through social media channels of your participation in MEP 2040. There's been a lot of work this last year with respect to the MEP 2040 website, and there's continuing maintenance that we'll be making through the end of this year and into next year for continuing to clean up and organize so that it is as hopefully as functionally useful to our signatories as we can make it. There is a new form for signatories to submit company plans to reduce embodied carbon. And this is a reminder to all of us as signatories that, you know, the things we need to do, developing a company plan is one of the very important things that we want to make sure that we are holding ourselves accountable for so that we have appropriate governance as an organization. So there is a pathway now for signatory firms to begin to share that information with MEP 2040, and we'll be looking in 2023 at sort of reviewing those programs. Similarly, there's a resources submission and posting process that we've developed, which follows something very similar to the form for submitting company plans. And this is meant to be sharing of resources that are related to the work that we're doing in embodied carbon and otherwise. And the important thing about this is that we want to be able to link to our signatories' websites so that we can help drive traffic to your website. So if you have case studies, white papers, things like that that you believe are going to be useful to others in the industry to help us move this forward, then please consider going to the website, clicking on that link and sharing that resource. We'll review it, we'll get it posted so that it can then be shared with the rest of the group. And then just as a, you know, we have an ongoing bi-weekly meeting series. We've got a relatively small group that's working in our industry here, or in our working group, relatively small number of members. So if you do have, again, folks that are specifically valuable in your organizations for communications, please reach out to us, get involved, help us continue to make that process move forward faster. I'll turn it over to Stefan for partnerships.
All right, thanks, Rob. Hello, everyone. The partnership group began 2022 really focusing on increasing the number of signatories and supporting organizations that have signed on to 2040. And I think what you saw in the beginning of our presentation, that goal continues into 2023. We also focused on the way in which this work might fit in with two critical things for integrated design teams as we work together to achieve what I'm just going to borrow from the beginning of the session, a Carbon 180. I love that Mike is here from SE 2050. I'm an architect, and I know that when we work together, that's how you get the best results, and you have to have a holistic perspective. And so one effort and accomplishment, just in terms of road mapping from a team perspective, is that we have a content advisory board member from our steering committee on the Owners Can playbook development under building transparency. And so we are, under the Mindful Materials framework, which was mentioned earlier, where we can really take into consideration a number of impact categories, not just embodied carbon, but 18 individual impact categories, for example, and how they are all referenced through different types of commitments. There's a beta version of this portal available now, which you should check out. And I imagine that's one place where we can begin to answer a number of questions that are driven not only by clean criteria or priorities, but also by our own climate action plans and by the hyper acceleration of data transparency that's being sought by ESG reporting and the financial investment community. So those impact categories are then also mapped onto a roadmap, and this is where the Owners Can playbook is illustrated there. We have a small group working on adding the role of the MEP team in that effort across a project workflow, and that's something that we were hoping to have done by this quarter, but we're still working on, and so that's an early goal for 2023. We also know that now we can really begin to leverage a lot of the work that the other groups have developed and build upon some of the things we even heard about today, such as policy development. And maybe there's a policy working group that we could introduce under partnerships and see what happens there. But we really want your ideas and feedback, I think, starting now on the chat box as well. So that's an overview from our group.
Super. Thank you to all of the working group leads and everyone who's been participating this year. I put a note in the chat just to reiterate the participation in the working groups is one of the core tenets of the MEP 2040 commitment at the moment, and it's both an effort to try to make sure that we are getting as many diverse perspectives into the work as possible, so that everything that we're doing is applicable to everyone here and beneficial to everyone here, but also to be really equitable in terms of trying to make an industry initiative work with input from lots of folks and not overburdening any one person. We all have an insane amount of work to do during the day. I know for a fact. So with that, I would like to hand it over to the manufacturer working group to say some words about the Q1 forum for 2023.
Sure, so I'll jump in. This is Adam. I'm working closely with Christy Wilson and Josh Jacobs as well. So as I had mentioned, for Q1 of next year, we've done a lot of work. We had some great presentations at each of these forums, from kind of the policy side, the engineers' perspective, a lot of other perspectives. What we haven't really fully represented yet is the manufacturer perspective, because they're very, very key to making this happen and making the investments and understanding the value proposition of reducing their embodied carbon as well. So we wanted to have a session at the quarterly forum dedicated to them to talk about what they're seeing from their perspective. Really invite a lot of manufacturers to jump on to this forum if they haven't been doing the quarterly forums thus far, so they can get a little more insight into what the process is like from others that have done it, and also just start to voice concerns that they have, so that if us as specifying engineers and others as policymakers are creating these requirements, that we understand the full context of what we're asking for. So this is just an outline presentation for that. We're going to invite probably 2 to 3 different manufacturers. We have a couple confirmed already on the screen there, to give some brief presentations about why embodied carbon is important for the future of their business, reflections they've had on EPD process for them. I think a key is, who are the key stakeholders in their organizations that can help make decisions? So that's helpful for engineers to know who to reach out to advocate, but it's also helpful for maybe if some manufacturers are just starting on their journey, how have others engaged the organization to make it a priority? So we'll talk about that. And then if there is a data that's available today or will be coming very soon, this might be a good place that they can start to push that out so we can start to work on that. And at that time, we also hope to have a sample specification template. This would be language that we can all start to use in our specs when we want to ask for EPDs or other embodied carbon data for manufactured products. And then we'll have an open forum similar to today to ask questions and everyone can talk. I don't know, Christy or Josh, do you want to add anything else to that?
I think you did a great job, Adam. Nothing for me.
Great. Adam and Christy, thank you. If anyone does have any suggestions on content that we should try to incorporate into that forum and or the EPD and manufacturer forums that are working in parallel track to the broader MEP 2040 forums, please do send a note, sign up for the working group, give us that input and feedback and join in. I did also drop in another note in the chat with a reminder of the place on the MEP 2040 website where you can sign up for a working group to make sure that you're on the list to receive updates on when those working groups are meeting, what the agendas are, etc. With that, I think we are at the end of the fourth forum for 2023, for 2022. Don't get ahead of myself. And again, just really excited and thankful for everything that we've been able to do together this year. We're open, we can open the floor, take down the slides for any final Q&A, commentary, words of celebration and gratitude. The floor is yours, and we'll wrap it up after that.
Okay. Okay.
Well,
Julie, I think that we are all just stunned by the magnificence of this forum and the graciousness and elegance with which you have facilitated it. So,
Julie, could I interject with a question?
yes, absolutely. Please do. And Kaylee, would you mind taking the slides down? Thank you.
Just for someone just beginning their career and wanting to learn more about this and the impact it has on MEP, is there somebody to follow on LinkedIn? Is there a newsletter to sign up for? Like how to stay plugged in?
That's a good question, Drake. I think being part of MEP 2040 is a really excellent place to start. The CLF also has hubs not in each, but in many cities across the US. So there's probably a hub near you that you could also get engaged in to be able to continue to talk about embodied carbon specifically. On the operational carbon side, there are just a plethora of options to get engaged. I would say the CLF Carbon Leadership Forum currently has a LinkedIn profile, and they post events and upcoming updates and things, and they're excellent to follow on LinkedIn to stay on top of what those updates look like. And there are currently 4 active working groups in this space specifically for MEP 2040. The link to how to sign up for those are on the website. And I would highly encourage you to consider joining one of those working groups to continue to meet other folks in this space that you can stay in touch with. Does anybody want to add anything to that in terms of mentorship, where to find information, etc.?
yeah, Drake, this is Andrew Himes from the Carbon Leadership Forum, and I'd also like to encourage you and anybody else on this call who is not yet a member of the CLF, just join the CLF, go to the carbonleadershipforum.org website and click on join the community. And you'll be part of an online community and discussion of decarbonization of of the built environment. You'll be invited to meetings such as this one. You'll be getting the regular monthly CLF newsletter, which includes regular updates on advances and successes in related to the MEP 2040 initiative, as well as a number of others. So welcome to the community, and help us make it big and massive and important and effective.
Definitely. Yeah, Drake, thanks very much for the question. I would be remiss if I didn't ask Vincent if you would like to say anything, given your role in another organization that we've been talking about relative to the 2030, 2040, 2050 goals. No pressure, but thank you very much for joining. And we're continue to be extremely, grateful for everything that you've been doing, and open, having open arms to support us and for us to support you and to help figure out how to bring it all together.
Oh, thanks, Julie. I'd say that Architecture 2030, while we're the catalyst for much of this, including the AIA 2030 commitment program, the AIA particular folks that have joined these conversations in the past are the best connections to the 2030 commitment program. What I'll offer, and I offered this in the SE 2050 advisory group meeting yesterday with Michael and others, is that all of these efforts are integrally related. And Architecture 2030 sees the efforts that we produce to link all of them together. So we've tried to bring the professionals that have been leading on all of these topics to the forefront of a variety of different audiences. I think it's great to have the White House representatives here today as a great example of that. But the work that you all are doing is so absolutely critical to showing policymakers what is possible. And so I think there's going to be more opportunities for integration between all of the different initiatives. It's not just the ones that have numbers at the end of them, the 2030s, the 2040s, and the 2050s, but there's a climate positive design in the landscape architecture community, of which we've been more directly partnershiped with over the next few years. But there's also a contractor's commitment as well. So I've been involved in some dialogues about communications and relationship building since about the summer. Some of those went a little bit dormant while the data side of the conversations move forward, but that's something I'm very keen to kick back up into the new year. So you'll be hearing from me on that topic, and I hope that many of us can collaborate amongst these various organizations and structures to move everybody forward together.
Awesome. Vincent, thanks very much. And apologies to put you on the spot. I just saw you on the list and wanted to make sure you had a chance. Marissa.
Hi, everyone. This is Marissa Zolkowski. I'm with McDonald Miller Facility Solutions. We're a new signatory, so we're so excited to join this group in an official capacity. So plans are underway for us to work towards the goals, and I'm wondering if there's anyone that's part of the forum that would be willing to have a phone call with me to, brainstorm our best approach to taking this on for all of our projects, and then discuss best working group for us. So I know there have been a lot of recent signatories, so wondering if anyone would be willing to chat on the phone with me.
That is an excellent question, Marissa. And I wonder if maybe that's something that I could also take back to the steering committee to see if there's a sort of start of the year open house for MEP 2040 for folks who have not been on all of the forums, who haven't been in the working groups yet, just to sort of have a moment to help everybody get situated. If anybody is really interested in talking to Marissa, please do put that in the chat, provide your contact information, but Marissa will also follow up with that to make sure that you and others have that support to feel like you can be as engaged as you want to be.
Thank you. That sounds great.
Super. And thank you for the question. Much appreciated. Luke.
Yeah, maybe just a little update that many of you know that MEP 2040 is working, some members are working with SRAE together to do the TM65 America version or North America version. And that process is ongoing. By early next year, we will have that version of North America to start informing the EPDs or EPD light, in this case, of the MEP equipment. They already have hundreds of the EPD lights of MEP equipment in Europe, so that's coming our way. And the other opportunity, that is one of the first circular economy standard, TM66, not very popular in North America yet. I think there's an opportunity there to inform embodied carbon through a circular economy to achieve reuse, repurpose, or all the RE things you can think of to make sure there's no waste. I think that could be an opportunity for us together to look at how we're going to do that in America to eliminate waste and form a circular economy.
Awesome. Luke, thanks for sharing. Andrew, could you answer the question from Jared in the chat about how to get what the best way is to get onto the mailing list for MEP 2040? My assumption is to sign up for a working group, and then you're on the list.
Yes, that would be the way that people get onto the mailing list, for the most part, or mainly, is that their companies join as signatories or as organizations that are signing in support of the MEP 2040 initiative, and then they are added as part of that. But I think that may be something that we are missing on the website. We probably need to add a button that says "Add me to the list." To the mailing list, and when you're on the MEP mailing list, you're also invited to all the meetings as well. So yeah. I will take that as a directive. I will add a button and a little field to put in your email address and name.
Love it. Thank you very much. Randall.
Hi, so the previous speaker asked, I thought it was a very good question, and it sort of struck a chord, and that is kind of thinking about, you set the target, but then there's always a big question of how do you get there, and that's sort of a design question. So the first part of my question is there like a design working group that's sort of focused on design activities, and how do you actually design for these to reach these targets and exceed them? The second part is I'm part of another organization called the International Council on Systems Engineering. We've got a couple of working groups. One of them is doing some work with the circular economy, and it is more focused on sort of design paradigms for, how do you do this kind of work, finding examples, getting the information you need to, come up with innovative ideas and so on. Anyway, so the question is there interest in kind of developing that conversation? It strikes me that I could probably reach out to the people working in the partnership area or the communications to discuss this further. Anything I'm missing there? I'm an architect, by the way, and also involved with AIA Connecticut, so I have a little bit of a platform there. We could try to do some outreach. So how do you do that?
Awesome, Randall, thank you. Please feel free to contact any one of the steering committee members that have put their email in the chat to follow up. The working group question is a really, really good one on the design side in terms of how are we picking that up. To date, it's been more implied as part of the partnership piece, right, with the supporters and the various architecture firms that are coming on board. It's been implied in the data and reporting section in terms of the event, like one of the goals long-term is to in fact collect case studies and understand what the design strategies are that are allowing the reductions that folks are achieving, to be able to share that knowledge and start to create some benchmarks and or rules of thumb. I think it's also implied in the communications team, but I would say the partnership and the data side are probably where the strongest link is at the moment. I would say and Stefan, let me know if you disagree, but Stefan is probably the best first person for you to reach out to as a fellow architect in this space. And then we can go from there in terms of how case studies start to show up in support of the way that we're starting to collect project information. And a significant part of that, like you're saying, is definitely on the design strategy side.
Mhm.
Thank you for the question. Stefan, do you want to add anything?
Email me, Randall.
Okey doke, will do.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Beautiful. All right, we are 9 minutes out. We're down to 54 people. I think people are, I think we're in a spot where we should wrap up. There are no more hands raised. Thank you again to everyone for your participation, for an incredible 2022. We will, I think our goal is to have the social media templates linked on the MEP 2040 website under resources. Andrew's nodding, great. So that will be on there to make sure that you don't have to cache the Google Drive link. So we'll put that on the website so it's easy to find whenever you need it. And I think what we're gonna aim to do over the next few weeks is to add to that collection with a 1-year summary to snag the graphics that we shared at the beginning of the meeting, and make sure that you have access to them so that you can share them on your LinkedIn profile or website or wherever it is that you would like to celebrate your involvement and what we've been able to do together in the industry. So with that, I hope everyone has a fantastic Thursday weekend when you get to it, holiday season, and we will see you all in 2023.
Thank you, Julie. Congratulations, everybody.
Thank you.
this
Thanks,
year.
Vincent. Much appreciated.
Thank you, everyone. This was a really good one. I enjoyed it.